It's great to see some friends in the audience. Now, since I started working on basic income too many years ago to admit, something's happened. For many years, we were regarded as strange economists with strange maverick views. But in the last 3 years, suddenly, there's something in the water. And last year, about this time, I received an email inviting me to go to talk about basic income to the Bilderberg Group. Now, to most of you, the Bilderberg Group will be meaningless, but it was an organization set up after the Second World War and has some of the world's elite people who meet in secret once a year. I thought it was a joke from a lefty friend who was pulling my leg. But it turned out they called me several days later and they said, "No, why haven't you answered? Why are you not coming to our meeting in Dresden?" And I said, "Well, I thought it was a joke, but yes, if you wish." And I consulted some of my political friends around Europe, and they all said, "Guy, you have to go." So a couple of weeks later, I found myself talking to a smaller group than this about basic income, asked to speak for an hour. And there, approximately where you're sitting, was Henry Kissinger. Not one of my favorites, but interesting type of person to be listening to basic income. Next to him was Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. Then there were 3 prime ministers, 1 king, 5 ministers of finance, and the chief executive of Google, Eric Schmidt, and the chief executive of the biggest companies in the world. I thought they'd all rush to the nearest bar to get some drinks. But instead, I watched Christine Lagarde in the audience, and she was scribbling notes, and several US presidential candidates were in the room, and they were doing the same, and I thought, this is very strange. And afterwards, they came up to me and discussed it, and a remarkable number, and this was Chatham House rules, so I'm not allowed to say who said what, but all I can tell you is a remarkable number of those people, hardly kindred spirits in many respects, said, "Guy, I'm convinced this is right. I'm convinced that this has to be the response to the crises that we're facing." It was very strange because after that, a few weeks later, I got invited to the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum. There was a man sitting there, a politician, next to me. I thought, what am I doing here? And at the end of my talk, he stood up and he said, "Look, I thought I hadn't needed to study this, but I now realize I've got to." It was Al Gore. Then I got invited to Davos this January to give 3 speeches at Davos. This sort of thing does not happen to someone like me, an ordinary economist. But it tells you that the debate around this subject has taken off and become a central, serious subject. And when I saw the report, the economic report that had been tabled in Delhi, the end of January, this chapter 9, I had to say congratulations to the authors for the courage, intellectual courage, the way it was couched, a serious document. And I think this too is a reflection of both a crisis and a change of orientation in the way people are thinking about the great questions of economics. But there's a saying about cricket that I want to mention. Now, friends here, such as Santosh or Ashwani, will correct me, because I think of it as a saying made by John Arlott many years ago. And if it was him, it suits his personality. But he said, what does he of cricket know who only knows of cricket? There you are. I think that's right, actually.
Beyond the boundary.
Beyond the boundary, yes. John Arlott used to say it in that lovely voice. That's why I always associated with John Arlott. But the point I want to make is, although I'm an economist, the primary justifications for a basic income are philosophical or ethical. And there are three major reasons why we should regard basic income as something desirable. The first one, and the Honourable Minister alluded to that, is that a basic income is a matter of social justice. The wealth of all of us, the income of all of us, is far more to do with the efforts of our ancestors than anything we do ourselves. But the public wealth, we don't know whose ancestors contributed to it, but we can say that we have a right to public inheritance, a social dividend, a return to the collective wealth that as individuals and members of society, be it India or Britain or anywhere else, we should have an entitlement, a right. This theme is thought of in connection with Thomas Paine, G.D.H. Cole, a number of other people who have alluded to it, Bertrand Russell. But I think it's a very, very important one, that social justice is a justification for moving towards a basic income. And that is why I think one of the really critical points in our debate at this moment is how it is framed, how it is imagined. And the idea of citizen dividends or social dividends or green dividends is something which moves us away from thinking of it just as an alternative form of welfare. I think that's important. The second rationale for a basic income is that it would enhance Republican freedom. Freedom is very important, and too many social policymakers over the years, often driven by, in my view, a mistaken view of socialism, in that the state has to drive people, have given too little attention about giving freedom to ordinary people. A basic income would advance rights, economic rights. It would combat paternalism and charity. And in that regard, I thought the first quotation from Mahatma Gandhi in that chapter 9, there was one line which I thought was particularly important. Gandhi says that in looking at the other person, we should apply the following test. And the test is, will the policy, he didn't say policy, he said it, restore him or her to a control over his or her own life and destiny. And for me, a basic income would help in that direction. It would enable people to have a greater sense of control of their own life and their own ability to develop their competencies, or whatever the term we might wish to use. And I think you can see that in contrast to driving people to perform manual labor on the roads as a condition for receiving some sort of pittance, where quite often you'd be using up more calories in the heavy labor than you'd receive in the income if you receive it at the end of the day. A basic income is emancipatory because it gives people a sense of control. And one of the arguments we have developed in the book on our pilots, and there are copies outside, as you can see, available, is that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the monetary value. It's an argument that can be developed at length, and it's one that I think is quite a powerful one economically and philosophically. And in a sense, you can go to the next stage by saying that in most of the communities that we're thinking about, money is a scarce commodity. And any scarce commodity results in the rise in the price of that commodity. So if money is scarce, the cost of money, particularly to the low-income people, rises dramatically. That is precisely what you see. It's obvious. But in a sense, the fact that money is a scarce commodity, you change that when you provide a basic income as a universal amount. It ceases to be a scarce commodity, and this drives down the price. And for those people who have less of that scarce commodity, they benefit disproportionately. Basic economics. Now, a basic income would also empower people. It's a universal right. It's non-withdrawable. You can't have it taken away from you for some other reason. It's fundamentally a right. It's an assurance of a future flow of resources, which gives you that security. It's individualized, and it's unconditional. All of those things contribute to freedom. And that leads to the third justification of a basic income. The third justification is that a basic income, obviously, even if it's a small amount, increases basic security of the recipients and the community of recipients. And recent psychological research, including some by economists, have shown that people who have basic security in their mind, psychologically, have greater mental bandwidth, mental stability, and the capacity to make long-term strategic decisions. Basic security is a need, and it is given too little attention by too many people. It even lowers the IQ if you are chronically insecure. Stands to reason. And good basic income pilots have actually shown that people with basic income improve their IQ and capacity to make strategic decisions. Now, for most of us, that should be obvious, but our policymakers have not incorporated it adequately into their decision-making. Now, there are also instrumental economic advantages of a basic income. I've just completed a paper for UNCTAD where I've reviewed all the available cash transfers and basic income pilots, and I have some copies available if you're interested. And the evidence is striking that cash transfers and basic income payments increase economic growth. They have a multiplier effect beyond the direct effect. Basic Keynesian economics, the multiplier effect is quite big. And they have an automatic stabilization role, which macroeconomic policymakers should be pleased about. In addition, and paradoxically, a universal cash transfer, as a basic income is, has a greater positive effect on inequality. In other words, it reduces inequality by a greater extent than targeting cash transfers. In other words, a universalistic scheme, because it has fewer exclusion errors, obviously, reduces inequality more than doing targeting schemes by means testing or proxy means testing or whatever type of means testing you wish to follow. I think that's quite an interesting finding in the design of policymaking. Now, there are also institutional reasons, and the minister alluded to some of those, and these are obviously very familiar to all of you in this room. In India, because a basic income is transparent, you know that everybody is getting 300 rupees, 500 rupees, or whatever the number is, it reduces the potential for corruption of a petty kind. It is also easy to demonstrate that there are far fewer and lower administrative costs in a scheme like this than in any of the others. Obviously, but in a case like India and in many other countries, those costs are very high, and we should not minimize them by neglecting them in our discussion. Now, I think it's interesting that the global discussion about basic income has taken off for a number of reasons. It's taken off because the growth of economic insecurity with globalization has become a global pandemic. We suffer from chronic economic insecurity. And that will not improve by itself in India or anywhere else. But we also have a number of interesting debates that we won't go into during this conference, but I think you should keep them in the back of your mind, that one of the reasons why basic income is suddenly having a new popularity with some of these chief executives of global multinational corporations is that they see the march of the robots. The robots are coming, automation is coming, and suddenly there's going to be mass technological unemployment on the horizon. I personally don't fully subscribe to this lump of labor fallacy, but I do subscribe to the view that the technological revolution that we're undergoing is increasing the inequality of the economic system, and it has helped in the breakdown of the old income distribution system as such. We will not see globally a rise in real wages on average. More and more of the total income is going not just to capital, but to rental forms of capital. And that's what I've dealt with in a new book called The Corruption of Capitalism. And we're going to see that persist. So we have to build a new income distribution system. In the longer term, that is part of the context of our discussion, because I believe that a basic income has to be part, an anchor, like a boat anchor, part of that new income distribution system. Now I'd like to turn, if I may, a few minutes, to some of our findings from the pilots. As Renana and Sarath have mentioned, when we began our pilot work, and it takes me back to 2008 when I was in Ahmedabad talking to Sewa leaders about it, and some of those young women there decided that the pilot should be done. If I'm honest, it was neither me nor the leadership, but some of those young women suddenly stood up and said, why don't we do a pilot in India? And it was music to my ears. And it took us 3 years to get the bureaucrats and the people to agree to allow us to do it. And I'm very grateful to them because it gave us an opportunity to do these pilots. I've just been told I've got 5 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to summarize the results. You can do that by looking at the book and the technical report and number of papers we produced. But the points I want to make, and I will not show any PowerPoint as a result, is that the effect of a basic income is transformative. And what that means is that it doesn't just have one set of effects. we found that the welfare effects, for a start, were extremely positive. If by doing a randomized controlled trial methodology and comparing communities who are receiving basic income with communities that are not receiving basic income, we found that sanitation was improved, we found that health was improved, we found nutrition was improved, particularly among children, and we have found that schooling in terms of registration and attendance and performance all improved. These are the welfare effects. Fairly predictable, fairly positive, but notice we did not apply any conditionality. We did not say you have to do these things. There was a wonderful moment in the preparations when we were talking to members of the Planning Commission, and I remember several of them saying that we should have conditions applied because otherwise people will waste the money. And there was a lovely moment, and Renana should be congratulated for this because she'd brought some of the women from Bihar, from Sewa, and they were in that room, and one of them suddenly said, "Do you think you need to tell me what is best for my child?" And we won the argument. It was very powerful. The welfare effects are good. The second effects are equity effects. And what we found is that in all respects, girls benefited even more than boys. Weight for age, nutrition, registration in school. They went up for girls, particularly teenagers, more than for boys. In all respects, we saw a wonderful phenomenon. Women with disabilities were really strong beneficiaries. The picture on the book is of a woman in one of those villages who has no legs. Before the basic income pilot began, she lived without dignity. By the end of the pilot, she had her own sewing machine and a dignified position in the village. Then the third type of effect that comes through in the book is very, very important. The economic effects of the basic income are positive in several dimensions. First, the earned incomes of the recipients of basic income, the earned incomes, not including the basic income itself, were higher at the end by comparison with those who'd not received it. And very critically, against our critics, the amount of labor and work increased, not decreased. People who received the basic income were more energized, they were more able to invest in seeds or secondary activities, and they increased their activities. But if you'd only used main activity, you would not have picked this up. Official statistics fail in that regard, because it's secondary activities, and particularly by women, that increased the most. There was only one group for which wage labor declined, and that was for children. They were going to school. The economic effects also went through with assets and things like that. And that leads to my final points. Because the final point is that the emancipatory effects of the basic income were tangible, visible, and fundamental. The people who had basic income, even though it was a modest amount, very modest, 30% of subsistence, they reduced their debts. And at the same time, they increased their savings, even if they had debts. And they did that because they needed liquidity. Liquidity gave them the capacity to respond to financial crises when they hit. When there was a shock of an accident or an illness or a crop failure or something, they didn't have to turn to the money lenders lending at 50% interest rates. They were able to turn to their families and their communities for financial help. And what we saw was the emancipation went through to individual decision making. And when I'm talking about our pilots, when I'm talking to students or activists elsewhere, I end with the following story. Now, you know this story better than I do, so I feel slightly guilty in telling it. But I wanted to end by telling it because, for me, it still matters. There was one village where we went early in the pilot, where all the young women were wearing veils. And they wouldn't have their picture taken, and we needed to have their picture taken for the ID card at the time. And they had to go into a hut and have their picture taken. And when we went to that village, about 9 months later, towards the end of the pilot, I said to Sarath, who was with me, I said, "Do you notice a change in this village?" He said, "No." I said, "The women are not wearing their veils." And he said, "Yes." And we called them, some of the young women over, and we said, "This is a change. What has happened?" And one of them eventually said, "Well, before we had to do what people told us or expected. Now we have a bit of money, we can take decisions ourselves." That ability to take decisions for oneself is a very important aspect of freedom. Thank you very much.